Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of the AI Fringe. For those of you who were here with us yesterday, we are very glad to have you back. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, whether you've been to a Fringe event or whether you've not been to a Fringe event, we're very happy for you to be here and take part in this discussion in this community. My name is Justin King. I am a director at Milltown Partners, the conveners of the AI Fringe. For those of you who don't know Milltown, we are communications and policy advisors with offices in London, New York, San Francisco, Brussels, and Dublin. Now, last year in November, I celebrated my 6th anniversary at Milltown. During that time, I have had the opportunity to work with a range of clients, many of who themselves are developing or deploying AI on some of the most interesting and complex communications and policy challenges to help them navigate this rapidly changing world. But I have also had the privilege at Milltown of working on and now hosting 3 successive AI Fringes. At each of these events, I've gotten to learn from and connect with people from civil society, academia, industry, government, and the public who all share a deeply held mutual interest to answer and to explore and answer arguably one of the most consequential questions of our time. How can we create safe and beneficial AI for everyone? And it is in that hosting capacity that once again I find myself here on the stage of the Knowledge Center of the British Library, which is increasingly beginning to feel like home for the AI Fringe. Now, on any given day, we would have a lot to discuss. A topic like our future AI no doubt commands the close and sustained scrutiny that I'm sure all of us do in our daily lives, whether that be professionally or personally. But this particular day happens to be the day after the AI Action Summit in Paris has concluded. Delegates in attendance discussed a range of topics, including AI safety, questions of sustainability in training and deploying AI, creating AI in the public interest, to AI's impact on geopolitics. Now, I'm sure many of you here have already caught up on what happened in Paris via your morning newsletter of choice, or maybe you have just had time to glimpse the headlines this morning. Most notably, the UK government deciding not to sign the summit declaration alongside the United States and a number of other countries. But what does all of this mean in practice, and how will it impact you and the communities around you? One of the AI Fringe's core objectives is to unpack these AI summits and what they will mean for us here in the UK. We're fortunate to have delegates who are in the thick of the discussions in Paris, joining us later to share their insights and their conclusions from the summit. Alongside them, we'll hear from other experts who will be exploring key themes in AI discussed as part of the summit, including open source, sustainability, global labor rights, international collaboration, and the consumer experience. Now, in addition to the program that we will have in the auditorium here today, we will also have sessions that are in the Elliott Room, which is across the foyer and around the hall. Please do look out for those as well. Finally, we will have lunch breaks, refreshments, and opportunities to make new connections with other members of this community who are in attendance today. Now, before we get started, some housekeeping notes. Exits are at the front and the rear of the theater. If you have a mobile phone, please turn that off or put it on silent before the program begins. Now, sessions taking place in the auditorium are live streamed, and every session taking place here in the auditorium and in the Elliott Room will be recorded and published to the AI Fringe YouTube channel so you can rewatch the events that have occurred here. We invite you to join the AI Fringe conversation on social media. Our X, formerly Twitter handle, is @AI Summit Fringe, and our hashtag is #AIFringe. You can also join us in the conversation on LinkedIn, where if you just search for the AI Fringe, you will find us. And finally, if you are interested in taking part of this community outside of these events, we will be sending you an email a little later on to tell you how you can participate. Thanks in advance for supporting our code of conduct. It is very, very important to us and listed on our website. Now, on to our first panel. While it is right for our eyes to be on the prize of a positive future of AI for everyone, it is also our responsibility to ensure that the journey to arrive at that future does not cause harm in the present among those who are contributing to developing the technology. In our first session, our panel will discuss how we can enforce global labor rights across the AI supply chain, foster ethical industry practices, enhance transparency, and build public trust via best practices. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Melanie Garson, Andrew Dudfield, Joe Massey, Kanika, Joshi.
Gosh, good morning, everybody. How are you all feeling? Excellent. Are we all ready? Well, we've got a really exciting kickoff for the morning. I'm Dr. Melanie Garson. I'm the Cyber Policy and Tech Geopolitics lead at the Tony Blair Institute, as well as Associate Professor in International Security, just down the road at UCL. And today I've got an excellent panel with me who are going to introduce themselves in 1 minute, when we're going to really unpack. You know, people talk about AI supply chains. Most people's mind jumps to chips right now, or tariffs, or we talk about AI resources, and that's either drill baby drill or plug baby plug, depending on which side you're going to think about it. Unless we begin to unpack what are the human resources, where's in the human supply chain. Talk about human-machine teaming, but we're not actually thinking about what is going on with the humans on which our internet and AI ecosystem is built right now. So to help me unpack that, I have a fantastic panel. Would you like to go and introduce yourselves, starting with Kanika?
For sure, thank you. I'm Kanika Joshi. I've been an international development practitioner for about a decade now. I've worked in the intersection of everything gender, impact, AI, and data for the last 10 years across India, Kenya, UK, and beyond. I have worked in the Global South quite a lot. I belong from India, and I'm looking forward to this panel.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andy Dudfield. I work for an organisation called Full Fact. We're a fact checker based in the UK, and I'm head of AI there, which means I'm thinking about how we can use artificial intelligence to support the process of fact checking and how the data that is produced from fact checks gets used around the web. And absolutely delighted to be here.
Awesome. Hello, everyone. Glad to see I'm not the only one who wasn't invited to Paris. My name's Joe. I'm a senior researcher at the Open Data Institute. I lead lots of our work on participatory data, so looking at the ways that people can be more involved in the data economy, and I've done lots of work on data stewardship and data-centric AI as well.
Thank you. And unfortunately, we would have loved to have had another panelist with us today, but she's unable to join us. And that's like Kauna Malgui from the African Continent Moderators Union. But in place of her being able to join us, we're going to kick off with a very short video of some remarks that she gave at an event hosted by the ODI back in November for the Data Empowerment Fund. And I think that's going to give us a really good framing for this conversation. So if the video's working.
Yeah, as a content moderator, it's been a tough journey. And yeah, I would say being a content moderator, first, it comes with the way you've been employed. Most of us were employed via deception, I would say, because we're told we're going to be call center agents, we're going to be translators for our individual, like, local languages. For me, I was a content moderator for Hausa language, which is a northern Nigerian language. And when I started the interviews, I was told, you know, yeah, you're just going to review contents in Hausa to English. And yeah, the journey started. I got the job. And the week I started the job, that was when I realized I was going to work for Facebook. So it was a bit of mixed feelings because if it's going to be reviewing contents, I didn't see, there was nothing alarming. But then we're given a non-disclosure agreement to sign. And in that non-disclosure agreement, I remember we're just put in a room, around 5 to 10 of us, and we're told, okay, sign this. And we signed a non-disclosure agreement, and we're never given a copy of it. But one thing I remember is I was going to be jailed for 20 years if I ever disclosed I was working for Facebook. And that was the beginning of the whole roller coaster of emotions and exposure to toxic contents. Imagine the worst contents you've ever seen while scrolling on your Facebook page or Instagram. That is what we action, and we have 50 seconds to action each job or reported content. So we dealt with content around suicide, child abuse, exploitation, pornography, terrorist attacks, and all that. This job, it changes your life, and also the mental health toll it takes on you while doing the job, because you were never even prepared for it. You were never prepared for it. You were just exposed. You just got a job. You had a very little time of training, which was approximately 2 to 3 weeks, and most of the contents were blurred, in black and white and all that. So you didn't really see the actual blood, the actual graphic innards of humans and all that you thought you would have seen while doing the work. And a few weeks after, when we started the real job, now we started getting thousands and millions of toxic contents, which we have to filter off Instagram and the Facebook content. And that has been the job I've done for 4 years. And you can imagine the toll it has taken on me. But it's also a noble job in as much as it exposes you to a lot of things. It's a good job, it's a noble job because we've saved a lot of lives. We've protected a lot of people, which can be you and I. We've protected us in so many ways because we've escalated terrorism content. We've escalated it to the FBI when kids are being extorted, sextortions and all that. These are the jobs we've done, but at what expense? Because that is the most important thing we should ask, because these are humans that do this job.
Well, I'm sorry we don't have her here. I have so many questions I'd like to ask directly, and I'm going to come to you, Joe, in a moment to help reflect on that a little bit more. But before that, we've seen huge shifts, right, in the last couple of months, particularly on the platform level, that is sort of getting pushed a little to the side in these bigger narratives on AI. So I'd just like to come to you, Andy, for a few moments to kind of set it up for us, sort of where are we in relation to what has happened since that testimony, and if you could just sort of give us sort of a few thoughts on what does the community fact-checking content moderation scene look like at the moment?
Sure, of course. Obviously a very sobering video to watch, but I'm really glad that we got to share that as part of this. I want to reflect on a slightly different part of the picture, which is around fact-checking. As many of you might have seen in the news in January, Meta made an announcement that they were stopping their partnerships with fact-checkers in the US, which is, I would say, a significant backward step for them as a platform, because fact-checking, I think, is a really important part of the mix of what content looks like online. And fact-checkers are part of that connection of different roles that are first responders when we're looking at the information that we're seeing on social media platforms and on the wider web. And Meta have decided to move to a program of community notes in the US. It's unclear what's going to happen in the rest of the world, but I think it's what is happening in the US is something that we should definitely be keeping an eye on. And as part of that announcement, when Mark Zuckerberg was introducing this, he made the case that this was a freedom of speech thing, but also suggested that fact-checking was a biased discipline and was involved in censorship. And I just wanted to say that I strongly refute those things. I think fact-checking is a really important part of the ecosystem, and fact-checking is about adding context. It's not about removing content, it's about making sure there is more content, better content. And so these kind of terms are incredibly important. But I think there was a suggestion there of moving to community notes. And so we've seen these used on different platforms before, notably Twitter X has a community notes program. And they can be a really valuable thing. The idea of crowdsourcing information from the web can be really useful. Wikipedia is one of the most delightful parts of the internet because over time it grows. But what we have seen with the approach that's taken on Twitter is that often there is disagreement, and where there is disagreement, those community notes are not shown connected to the content. And that is problematic, because if you're looking for consensus before something can be published, it is unlikely that you'll find consensus on a lot of contentious issues. So I think I would much prefer a world where there are community notes and there are fact checkers and there is good media literacy and there's lots of different interventions about how we are consuming content on platforms. And I think the bit that kind of connects back to the AI part here is that Meta made this pitch that they wanted to make sure that more content was seen, and they thought they were maybe overreaching with some of their automated moderation. And I think how Meta choose to run their AI systems is obviously entirely up to them. But I do think that removing the kind of human part of this, where you have real dedicated people with expertise adding context, to me feels like a significant step backwards.
Well, thank you. And I must admit, I do like that image of fact checkers as information first responders, as the people that on that front line of our information consumption. As we've all felt, it's really powerful to hear, Kanika. You've been involved in this deeply in the Data Workers Inquiry and the project with the Apti Institute. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the panel that Kanika was part on brought together kind of experts. Kanika herself, a content moderator, the Apti Institute, who have been doing lots of work with data labelers in India, working in different contexts, and the Data Workers Inquiry, which is a group of researchers who are inquiring about data work through the workers themselves and empowering them to tell their stories. And I think the panel kind of really raised that kind of importance of showing the human labor that is going into AI. It's really powerful to hear from Kanika about all of this work that she's been doing, often extremely harrowing, often extremely lowly paid, often without much security or kind of transparency regarding the work that she's doing, and very limited labor rights. But it's really an important step to open up that box to understand what is actually happening to make these AI systems that we use every day work. And so I think we focus a lot on, when we talk about black boxes, we focus a lot on how the algorithm's making decisions, how it's generating content. We don't necessarily think always about what data's in there, how has that data been labeled, who's been involved in that process. So I think it's often called ghost work, this human labor, because it happens behind the scenes, deliberately out of sight, out of mind. And so I think a really important part of that panel, and love everyone to go and watch it, is taking a step towards raising awareness and increasing a bit of kind of transparency on the kind of full breadth of people who are working on AI. It's not just about the developers or the data scientists. It goes all the way through to people who are labeling data sets, whether that's saying whether a picture is a cat or a dog, whether that's having to mark particular images with certain tags for content moderation. It is these people who have done that work and who have had to trawl through days and days of non-stop, often harrowing imagery that make these systems work. So I think another comment made on that panel was that when Meta says, 99% of harmful content is already, not seen by our users because of our AI systems, it is because of people like Kanika who are working to tag those images, tag those videos, tag those things, so that the models are trained to see those things. So I think it's a huge, huge role that these groups are playing. And I guess it's something that's happening in all around the world, but predominantly in the global south. And I think Kanika will speak to this point a little bit more, but it's really interesting to see how tech companies are quite deliberate in dispersing this work around the world and kind of deliberately ensuring that workers in different contexts, while they face similar struggles regarding labor rights and having to see all of this content, they're deliberately kind of kept apart and reduce their ability to come together, to organize, to realize that the struggle is shared. And so I think there's a huge amount of work to be done in sharing these experiences, and I think that panel was a great first step in that direction.
Yeah, it's bringing new thinking to the concept of ghosts in the machine. It's so I want to turn to you, Kanika, and think about, Joe sort of alluded, this is almost like tech's Primark problem, right? We're getting something that we all assume is magically produced very cheaply without thinking of what's going on downward. Do you feel from your perspective that that's just we've fallen into that, or do you feel that this is part of a sort of deliberate structural choice?
It definitely is a structural choice. I feel bad working conditions in AI supply chain are not by accident. They're a structural choice, especially because we say invisible workers, we say ghost workers, and these are very frequent terms, like in the global north, in conferences when I go to New York and Paris, that I hear very often. But when you are sitting in India and sitting in Kenya, these are your friends. These are your neighbors who are doing these jobs. So it's actually very visible work. They get precarious contracts. They work in bad working conditions. They do not have labor rights because it's very the rights on their contracts don't exist. So where would they go for their right to entitlement and so on? And Tech Workers Community Union in Kenya does brilliant work around it. They ask for 3 simple things. They ask for dignified work. They ask for right to organize. And they ask for safe workplaces, which all of us here have a complete 100% right to. But to them, it's actually a matter of advocating for the basic human rights. And it's interesting that I also said human rights, because I don't see this issue as a human rights issue at all. I see it as an economic rights issue. I see it as a social rights issue. I see it as an environmental rights issue, as a cultural rights issue as well. And that's why I'm glad that we started with Kauna's testimony, because it just highlights how important the AI supply chain is and how really visible it needs to be, and how all of us need to talk more about it and advocate more about it, how we need more global standards which can protect these workers and recognize that they're actually doing the hard work for the AI economy, that because of which we can easily access all technology. We can easily use ChatGPT and get brilliant results, and many other tech sources and get brilliant results with. So yes, I do think it's a structural choice, and I hope that we choose better.
So thank you for that. And, it really resonated with one of the things my own research is on is looking at sort of tech companies as geopolitical actors, or the extent that they're amassing so much power throughout the stack that they're able to tip the balance, and that also governments have challenges raising the levers of things like standards on them because of our consequent reliance on different elements of this. And you raised sort of the point of what, do we need the tech companies to do? They sort of sit out of the order of compliance. This should sit within their corporate social responsibility. It should sit, and also you have consumer reliance on them. It's a sense of how many people are going to boycott their Instagram, or because they're worried about people still don't boycott Primark, so, even their Instagram. So what's potentially the solution to this? Or are there solutions to sort of either reducing human labor reliance, which of course has a consequent economic effects, which would be the other side of that? Or, what are the choices that could be taken here? And Andy?
It's a trite answer, but it is rather complicated. And I think there are definitely choices. I mean, as Kanika is brilliantly outlining, the way that the labour market is used for production of data that goes into AI models is very complicated, and also a huge amount of information is needed. When we're talking about AI models that are trained on billions of data points, that data is coming from somewhere. And I think it's kind of worth thinking about the spectrum of that as well, of sometimes that is people making decisions. It is this cat or a dog, so that your AI thing can definitely detect in your image whether it's a cat or a dog. That is a human making a choice. And then there is also the implied information that would come from scraped data or kind of unstructured information going into these things as well. So there's a huge amount of content that goes in. And also thinking it's probably worth thinking about some of the choices that are made on the content that goes out the other side as well, because these models are incredibly complicated, they're very big, and they give these impressions of giving these extraordinarily nuanced responses. I would say, as a fact checker, sometimes they are a little bit too confident in what they are suggesting, but also there are choices made here of what content to show and what content not to show. And I think it's worth spending some time on that as well, of a lot of these models will have in guardrails around them. We've seen this around elections, where people will dampen down your ability to say, like, ask a ChatGPT who to vote for, or ask it how to do an illegal activity. Someone is drawing a line around that. That is not, I don't think, a particularly clever thing that's happening inside the model. That is somebody making a choice to simply not give a response to certain questions. And I think we've seen this very recently with DeepSeek and kind of questions around Chinese politics. That is not because the model is specifically trained on a set of data. That is a choice that someone has made not to answer these things. And I think that kind of plays back to some of the things that I really think about in this area about where do we place trust? And I think it's really important that when we have these generative models that are capable of producing quite mesmerizingly wonderful things, that we do have those checks and balances as well, because if it is creating content that seems plausible and has all the things that we'd like to see, so ChatGPT can create something that has a citation and a footnote and has something in a Harvard reference style, that looks very persuasive. But when it's not actually pointing at real things, that becomes really problematic. And I think this kind of element of the data that is going in, we definitely need to interrogate that. And we also need to interrogate the choices about what data comes out, what we're seeing and not seeing, and also how do we ensure that people have the relevant skills to interpret the outcomes and have the right level of skepticism that is needed. And I think there was some BBC reporting that came out just yesterday where they'd passed some factual questions to a range of different generative models, and a very low percentage of high quality outputs. That's okay if the right caveats are placed around something, if you understand what the output is. And I think the danger perhaps is where we think that something is close to magical, when actually it's kind of just predicting what the most likely next word is, and doing so in such a way that seems magical. And we've got to spend time interrogating that and make sure that everybody consuming this information has those very, very necessary skills to be able to utilize new ways of consuming information.
Thank you. And one of the things I deeply worry about when I think about this, and I think about, the potential torrent of sort of toxic sort of wasteland that could become in our information ecosystem, is actually the amount of, if you take sort of Instagram platforms where there's lots of micro businesses, whether that's a gym trainer or somebody selling baked goods, or there's a huge amount of these micro businesses that exist. And if they don't have that space to do that anymore, there could be this consequent economic sort of effect on those individuals. So I'm going to come back to you, Kanika, sort of, and think about what is it about where we seem to be the direction of travel in this picture that is worrying you the most?
Yes, I think what worries me, so I'm usually a very optimistic person. So I like AI, I use AI on a day-to-day basis. Impact Circle focuses on AI, is creating demo products. So I'll caveat that first. What concerns me though, is that I feel that if we continue the current trends, we risk the same colonial extravist models where we're like extracting information from Global South and publishing in the Global North. We risk like similar models if we don't really focus on even looking at the Global South in general as a AI leader. If we don't look at Global South as a co-creator, and if we, like, I think I would encourage everyone to start doing that as well. There are so many young startups and that I'm seeing across Latin America, Asia, Africa, where people are coming with brilliant, mind-breaking solutions as well. But do they get the same amount of investment? They don't. The good thing is that, yes, conversations have now moved beyond Silicon Valley in the ways that there are other like non-tech audiences participating in the conversation around AI. But I feel that what we really need very strongly is a focus on seeing Global South as a thought partner and a leader so that we give like equal amounts of respect and dignity when we're having these conversations around it. And if we don't do that now, and if we start looking at Global South as the place for like cheap labor, like let's give the contract to the lowest bidder, then we will really risk like the same colonial models that have operated across all sectors. Like I think Joe alluded to this like when he was speaking, that this happens across industries. It's not an AI-specific problem. We see this in the food industry. We see this in the garment industry. But similar to how we've come up with solutions in these industries, like now when we go to a retail store, we look at a fair trade mark and then buy it. And when we go to a garment place, we look at a sustainability assurance and then buy it. I think AI kind of needs a similar assurance of like, oh, this was actually done ethically. This entire ethical supply chain was transparent, and there are global standards that can assure it. So I feel that's my concern, and yeah, just like letting you know that I love AI at the same time.
Absolutely. And you know, that's a really interesting point about labels, although I still stand by that the only label people care about is dry clean only. Everybody panics about dry clean only. Smoking will kill you. It's fine. Dry clean only, don't let it get wet. But thinking about, you know, Kanika's pointed to sort of some of the solutions she would like to see. Joe, from the work you've been doing, what do you think it's like when you think about the solution space that you'd like to see?
And I think Kanika alluded to kind of something that we've been focusing on quite a bit at the ODI recently is AI data transparency. And so I think that's a real area that needs a lot more work. So we've been kind of looking at particular different models, around 30 different models, and trying to learn a bit more about how these providers and developers talk about the data that is used to train these models. So where did they get it from? Does it include copyrighted information? Who's been involved in the kind of human supply chain of developing that labor? And as you might guess, it's not great out there. There's not heaps of good transparency. There are some pockets of really good practice emerging, but for the most part, you know, that at best you might get this model was trained from a data set from across the internet, which doesn't really tell you too much about what that's going on. So I think there's real low maturity in this space, and I see hopefully a move towards more transparency, and I think we'll get onto open source at some point, is a really interesting move. I think while we talk about transparency, I think something that was a big part of that work is inquiring in transparency for who. A lot of the work that happens in the transparency space is pointed towards maybe other developers, maybe policymakers, but there are a lot of people out there who might want to know about this and may not have the time to trawl through a data card or read the kind of technical paper that describes how a model has been developed. And so I think we need to think, and I would like to see that the kind of AI developers think deeply about what it means for a member of the public to understand what data has been used so they can make an informed decision about whether to use this model or that model. And so I think there's a lot of work in the transparency space. And then in terms of kind of building on some of the ideas around, I think there's a huge role for civil society and other researchers to support data workers, as I mentioned already. And there's the kind of emerging practice of kind of more ethical data labeling organizations like Karya, which is a non-for-profit based in India, which work to pay fair wages. They think about training going beyond simple data labeling, but try to get the people who are involved in data labeling to have that role as a side role, but to help them to also access other livelihoods which are potentially more secure in the future. And then one last addition is around potential movements in the way that models are being developed. I think there's now more and more focus on having a much stronger, smaller data set that's more accurately labeled, that's more specific to the use case that you want to use the model for. And I think that means that it's worthwhile for model developers to invest in data labeling, to make sure that it's very accurate, to make sure you have the right professionals telling you whether this image has this kind of medical thing or another kind, whether this music piece has these kind of notes or other ones. I think there's an interesting space now where the data labeling ecosystem may begin to move into these spaces even more than it already has done.
So the incentivized labeling, I'm always like visualizing the nutrition label of sort of the red, yellow, green, of kind of how much sort of, if you want fat or carbohydrate sort of equivalent from data that would flash up with our choices. So thinking about that, Andy, you alluded to this sort of lack of trust in the system. We've had a couple of solutions of thinking towards labels. How does that sit with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you were talking about the impact on lots of different people, the idea of micro businesses, people who are reliant on platforms to make sure that they have this voice. And that is obviously one of the amazing things about social media, is that a lot of people are able to have democratic access to publish what they need. And I think that then connects across to this concept of labeling, because people will use platforms if they feel safe. They will use it if it feels like a trusted environment. They will continue to use them if it feels like they can understand where the edges of something are. And what that looks like is obviously changing at the moment. We've seen, as I was describing before, changes in moderation policies from platforms. And also we're seeing lots of changes in content types. And so, as Joe was referring to there, that kind of idea of labeling of content is going to get really complicated. And we have to very carefully think about, if we want to try and say, okay, here is the context of which this model was generated in, and here is potentially some synthetic content that we might want to label, or here is some definitely real content that we want to label. That's going to get difficult, and then we have to try and make sure that we don't say if it's created by AI, it's bad, and if it's definitely real, it's good, because people are perfectly capable of making real content that does bad things. And so we've got to really consider, how do we not overburden users? And so we've got all of these new dynamics of information to display, hopefully using AI that's really powerful. I really like that line about hope. It's going to do really exciting things for us. And we've got to ensure that when you try and log on to Instagram and sort of, promote your fitness business, that all of your photos aren't covered with 20 labels, and people have got to forensically look at it and understand, okay, so this is about how the AI model was created, but this content has had a filter applied to it, and this content and it's just that we need to make sure that we allow people to make the decisions they need to make to understand where they place trust. And I keep coming back to that, and I think it's an important part of this process, that we need to, in all of these conversations, decide what some of the foundations look like. And I think that is, we're not going to solve it in however many minutes we have left, but I think that is the really important conversation to keep circling back to.
I would kind of like to know which fitness strategies I follow actually have filters applied to them, just for my own sanity. That would be nice. So, we thought a little bit about, the changes, but also acknowledging that we're in this period of hyper-acceleration, hyper-competitiveness, the sort of geopolitics of the race to AI was on already. It seems to be on, crack at the moment, of the way the rhetoric is going between, the Institute, we've been looking for a while at sort of models of access to compute to do, to acknowledge what Kanika was saying about how we make sure that there's equal access. We've seen DeepSeek being a disruptor both in how it's constructed and how it's trained, and what its relationship is with other data. We've seen similar new data. The one thing that did come out of the summit in Paris was different countries in Africa announcing their data center build. Togo saying they're sort of investing in a big data center, and these questions for access to technology. So we've got, our concerns times there's mass acceleration. So, I'll come back to you, sort of, Kanika. We're all optimistic. We all see the incredible enablement that these opportunities can bring. But, how do we balance that, and where should we really be thinking about sort of trying to push investment and conversation and interest towards?
For sure. I will actually take a step back and reflect on one conference that I attended last year in India, was the Global Partnership for Artificial Intelligence. It is so interesting to me because there I saw AI in action. I saw solutions related to sustainable development goals, right from healthcare to climate to education to agri-tech, everything. Name a problem and they had solutions for it. I feel in terms of future, like where should we headed? I think we need to be headed to this place where data, like my friend Linda Bonio from Lawyers Hub says, like data should be black, data should be white, data should be global north, data should be global south. Basically, it needs to be representative. I think I will be very hopeful if data and AI infrastructure, creation, the entire supply chain is representative. If people from minoritized backgrounds, historically deprived backgrounds, women of color, LGBTQI folks, like literally everyone, people with disabilities, young people, if we really see leadership and involvement as an equal stakeholder versus like a tokenistic mechanism for a representative of this population, I feel if AI can truly be for all, I think that would be like the best case scenario for me. And of course, there's a worst case scenario where there's like more automation and we're not able to, like the ethical piece of AI is not able to catch up. And that's why I think conversations like what's happening in Paris right now, what's happening in London right now, and across the standards and labeling ecosystem, I think they're so necessary and they need to keep up the momentum, because I saw like a video somewhere where like the tech is advancing at a high speed, high cutting edge industry, it's going fast. Civil society is trying to catch up, but are we moving equally faster in the same pace? I think when we're able to move at the same pace versus like horizontally, I think it would really like change things. So I'm hopeful and I'm looking forward to seeing like AI work for all.
Perfect. I think we're going to need a lot of unfiltered fitness to be able to keep up at that speed. Andy, thinking about how this, looks in relation to some of the regulatory frameworks that we're seeing, do you see that? I mean, particularly we've had the EU AI Act, we have the, DSA, we have the sort of DMA. Do you see any of them offering genuine assistance in trying to tackle this problem?
I mean, I think yes and no. I mean, I would say legislation around AI is just so incredibly difficult right now because legislation is a complicated thing to build and takes consensus, can take time, and AI is moving out, as you're saying, at such a rapid pace that we've got to try and understand how we can legislate for something that is continually changing rather than trying to legislate for a moment in time. And I think that means setting out some kind of higher level principles of the kind of things that we're interested in. And a lot of UK developing AI thinking seems to be focused around, say, frontier stuff. So how can we make sure that we're putting the safeguards around the most overtly, obviously, potentially dangerous kind of things, which would make sense. But I think there are very real use cases of AI being used by an awful lot of people at the moment that are important. And the Online Safety Act we're waiting to see some kind of test stuff going through that. But at the moment, something like the recent changes that Meta have been talking about, if they were to do that in the UK, would be absolutely fine. Platforms effectively are allowed to mark their own homework at the moment. And I think we've got to keep on taking a look at whether that kind of idea makes sense of outsourcing to these huge companies to make those kind of choices. And I think we can see it in some of the choices that were made just yesterday of the UK not signing the communique coming out from the summit, along with the US and quite a lot of other people, and just thinking about what are we looking to get towards? Because it was unclear, I think, about why the UK didn't sign it, but it kind of points towards maybe an interest in this kind of overt sort of free market kind of idea that I think possibly Joe might want to unpack in a bit, but I think there's a lot to take in there. And then also we have this interesting position where we're developing our own regulation here. We can see what's happening in the US, and then I think we're obviously listening to what's happening in the EU, where the Digital Services Act has been up and running for a while, and we're starting to see some relatively good, transparent reporting happening as part of that. But also we're seeing, we're still yet to see how much teeth it actually has. And then I think where it has percentage turnover fines, often seeing people finding ways to back away from that relatively quickly. So I would say legislation is an integral part of this. It is never going to move as fast as technology, but we do need to think a better view about what principles looks like. And in that kind of, to that hopeful point, I think the UK has a real opportunity here of saying, okay, we can do something that makes sense in a market that is definable and small enough in the best possible way that we can actually try something and do something really interesting here.
Yeah, well, we keep fact checkers busy to try and figure out why the UK didn't sign up yesterday. I'm sure that one or two of them are looking at that right now. And I agree, I think there's a huge opportunity for the UK to sort of think about actually what are the commitments to this ecosystem from its economic and social benefits, and how does it lead the way. Joe, what do you think about this direction sort of at the moment that's now been clearly solidified of the US and the UK pushing towards a direction, AUKUS and sort of, and I know you're itchy, we've got a couple of minutes and then I'm going to open it up to audience questions, so get your questions ready, but sort of thinking about where open source sits with all this.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interested to follow the kind of vice president yesterday talking quite a lot about growth. Obviously, the AI action plan here in the UK is very kind of growth centered. And I think it's really interesting that J.D. Vance yesterday spoke about how ideology shouldn't play a role in the development of AI. And yet, to me, the kind of way that Silicon Valley operates, we've seen it become more intertwined with the new president, suggests that there is an ideology here at play that is being integrated into the way that we design, develop, and deploy AI. So Kanika already spoke to ideas of extraction and that feeling that people are able to go and access and use data without necessarily considering some of the secondary harms that might occur from that. All technology is political to some extent, and so I think we need to think kind of, carefully about what kinds of ideologies. I think we need to be reflective over, some of the facts that some of these ideologies which we take for granted as maybe what we consider to be normal here in the UK. We need to make sure others are at the table and able to bring different views into these conversations. And so to kind of, I guess, move on to one of those interesting ones is the kind of conversations around DeepSeek and open source. And when we looked at DeepSeek, we found that actually it was, despite all of the conversation being around it being a really important open source model, we need to interrogate what open AI actually means. And so actually it scored very poorly in our transparency index when looking at how transparent DeepSeek have been about the data which was used to train the model. So a lot of the discussion around open source doesn't consider the data which goes into the models, doesn't always share kind of all of the information about model architecture and the code and the weights. And so I think it's, as Tim Nick Gabriel would say, those four things are what make up open AI, open source AI. And so I think it's really important that we refocus on that transparency, and we're at the ODI are very excited about the opportunity of open source AI models, and so we're really keen to see more of that and more openness around how AI is developed and deployed. And then just one last piece on the transparency point. Anthropic yesterday released an economic index talking about showing and releasing data about how people are using Claude and other models in the workplace. I think that kind of transparency about how these models are being used also is really critical in us understanding how they are being integrated into our daily lives. They are likely to change a lot of the ways that we work, the way we interact with each other, and having access to this data for researchers, for civil society, for other developers is really crucial in understanding how we need to maybe bring in some guide rails or not, and where there's real benefits to be had.
Yeah, I think one of the other things that was interesting that was released in Paris was there was this Roost that was the model with Jan LeCun and Eric Schmidt, as sort of these open source building blocks that are supposed to try and put a little bit more open safety into the fundamental building. I could keep asking them questions. We're running out of time. Are there any questions in the room for our fabulous panel? I think. Yes, the lady in the white shirt over there. I think there's a mic winging its way to you.
Thank you. It has been super interesting. I want to ask about more responsible practices and the idea to get to these like global standard, because we already have a bit like the UNGPs, the OECD guidance. So we kind of have these like global standard, but the problem is that they're not binding. So it is difficult to make companies actually, keep accountability for them to do it. So how do you see us pushing to these like actual global standard?
The $22 million fine question. How would to hear your thoughts? How would you try and get global standards enforced?
Yes, I think enforcement will always be tough, especially when we're dealing with technology that's so fast changing. But it's not possible. So I would say starting with the basics, like the basics can be, for example, in the context of the conversation that we've had so far, starting with the basics of fair work, fair pay, living income, really ensuring transparency, because things that can be replicated from other sectors, which have worked, which have been approved more widely universally. I think replicating those existing best practices would be our best shot at ensuring that these can be enforced. Now, corporates always will make pledges, and I think enforcing them that's why I feel that governments across the world have like a big role to play in being an equal stakeholder of AI. Like, I do think that digital public infrastructure, like looking at those aspects around open source, how DPI interacts with AI is like so essential. So I would say it's important, but I don't have the clear answer to it. But yeah, start with basics, replicate what works in other sectors.
Yeah, I think something really important in terms of enforcement may not always work, and it sounds like the US isn't going to be too interested in any EU enforcement on these rules going forward either. And so I think we kind of really need to think deeply about meeting some of these organizations where they are and maybe reframe some of these issues into things that they could be interested in, whether that's growth, innovation, development of technology. And so, I mean, given that transparency, for example, isn't happening particularly often, to me it's therefore quite innovative, that an organization would share their data openly. And so I think repositioning some of these concepts and ideas and showing these organizations that it can be positive not only for society, but also to potentially their bottom line and their development of and growth in developing technology, I think can be a step towards that goal.
I think just to build on that as well, it's also a bit about modeling good behavior. At Full Fact, we're a fact checker, we're also a technology organization, and we use AI to help out with the process of fact checking, and we work with 50-odd other fact checkers around the world to do this. And we always try to be incredibly clear when we're describing what we do about it being a human in the loop, about what technologies are involved in the inputs and the choices we're making. And I think that kind of transparency is just really important, particularly in these kind of worlds where the idea that a choice made by AI is a political choice, is a choice around where you're placing trust and making sure that we're clear where humans are doing something and where they're not. And I think there's something that I've been really learning in working in some very different information environments around the world, particularly working with some fact checkers in the Middle East over the last year or so, is that information context can change. The environment people are working in can change. What the internet looks like can change for some people. You know, it is just Facebook in some places. It is a much more disparate information environment. And so I think a lot of us who are using AI can model those thinking around what transparency looks like. And also we can also try and ensure that we are cognizant of the fact that the information environment we're operating in is radically different everywhere in the world.
Well, sadly, we're out of time nearly, but I think that's a really good place to end with this concept of we're facing some of the world's most innovative companies, the companies that claim to have some of the most creative minds in the world. That if they can turn some of that creativity to really, whether it's thinking about this in a frame of corporate social responsibility, whether it's thinking about it from the investment framework, or whether it's sort of raising them the challenges, who can innovate this to be the most transparent and as safe as the best, and that there is a real world consequence of that for their use and their user base and their future, I think we might hopefully see a little bit of change moving forward. Well, that was an intense set of thoughts to kick off the day. What more could you want from 9 o'clock in the morning? I would like to thank you all for being here. I'd like to thank panel, I think, Kanika, Andy, and Joe. It's been absolutely tremendous. And we hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.